We're going to be examining what real places on Earth have been the inspiration for the nine realms of Norse mythology. So I do want to clarify is that some of these realms might be real places whose lores was stretched with time, and they could have been inspired by one place or multiple places. Sometimes the place is inherited from an ancestral culture but projected onto a certain location. Both Asgard and Helheim are of Proto-Indo-European origin but might have been projected onto a single place. At least Helheim might. I don't know about Asgard. So, also to note is none of the following is conclusive. We barely have sources that give accurate and detailed depictions of the nine realms according to Norse mythology, because most of these were written down by Christians. And also, note that distant lands have been identified with heavenly places beyond the reach of ordinary man. This would apply to places like Asgard. Of course, Snorri Sturluson tried ephemerization, but that's not what I'm trying to do, because I have no agenda. So I do want to clarify about the north and south direction. In Norse culture, north is considered to be the abode of death and south is the realm of the divine. This is probably because the north is cold and inhospitable, while the south is warm and prosperous. Indeed, the ice-cold north struck a sense of uncertainty and fear for the early Norsemen. In fact, one of the prophecies in Ragnarok, the destruction of the worlds, was a period of long winter, which reflects the fear of the Norsemen on the cold winters. As a result, most desolate and cold realms will be positioned to the northern parts of Scandinavia. Let's look at Midgard. This means middle enclosure, and this realm is where us humans inhabit. Of all the realms in Norse mythology, Midgard has attestable cognates in other Germanic languages. In Old English, it was Midangard. It is from Proto-Germanic "Mediana Gardes". This refers to the inhabitants of man, and it is called Inengard, or in the enclosure. Inengard contrasts with Utengard, meaning out the enclosure, and tends to roughly refer to Jotunheim. In Germanic culture, the world was divided into two: inhabited and civilized versus the uninhabited and wild. An outlaw was thus called Skogmardur, or man of the forest. Thus, Midgard was wherever the people were. Another name for Midgard was Mannheim, as used in the poet Edda Hrafnagardr Odin's stanza 24. The nine realms of Norse culture, and thus we need to set Midgard for the Norse. So, in the 4th to 1st century BC, when the Proto-Germanic languages were together, we could see that Midgard could be the southern tip of the Scandinavian peninsula, or Denmark, or both. As you can see, Scandinavia was inhabited by these Germanic people for a long time, and expansion only began during the fall of the Roman Empire and even during the Viking Age. But we found our Midgard. Now let's find Jotunheim, the other famous realm. Snorri Sturluson writes, "Our ancestors divided the universe into nine worlds and these again into three groups: over the earth Mooseballheim, Ljosalfheim, and Asaheim; on earth Jotunheim, Midgard, Vanaheim; and below the earth Svartalfheim, Niflheim, and Niflhel." Okay, I'm going to take this with slightly a grain of salt due to the possibility of Christian influence. However, it is interesting that Jotunheim and Midgard are paired to each other, suggesting they might be in the realm of mankind and not some heavenly or unheavenly place. And if Jotunheim is Utengard, representing the settlements outside, which are wild, crazy, and hostile, the place of the Jotuns or frost giants, and the place which is frozen land must be found, because that's what Jotunheim is. And I think of the Scandinavian mountains, which fits the descriptions of Jotunheim. Sturluson wrote, "King Gylfi used the lands that are now Svitjord, which is Sweden. Of him it is said that he gave a wayfaring woman a plough land in his realm, as large as 4 oxen could plough it in a day and night. But this woman was of the Asa race. Her name was Gefjun. She took from north from Jotunheim 4 oxen, which were the sons of a giant and her, and set them before the plough. Then went the plough so hard and deep that it tore up the land, and the oxen drew it westward into the sea until it stood in a sound. There Griffin set the land, gave it a name, called it Sealand, where the land had been taken away became afterward a sea, which in Sweden is now called Logren. And in the Malar Lake the bays correspond to the capes in Sealand. Thus says Brage, the old skald. This is in Poetica Fooling of Grapple, chapter 1, stanza 1. So Jotunheim was to the north of Sweden, and part of the Sweden is roughly around Lake Malar, and which is close to Stockholm, and Sealand might be the island that is Zealand. So from the passage we can see where Jotunheim is in a general sense. And the Scandinavian mountains fit the general description of Jotunheim, and we also have to remember that northern Europe during the Middle Ages was having a period of an ice age, so expect glaciers beyond these mountains as well in the Arctic regions. So this map might show where Jotunheim is when it was being first projected. Utgard Lokier Skrimir. Let's talk about him. A passage in the Prose Edda mentions this. It's too long, but what we do have to know is that Thor went east, clear to the sea, and then after going east of Jotunheim, he crosses a deep ocean and goes on shore with the other side with Loki. And there they meet Skrimir, which is Utgard Loki, a Jotun. The place Thor went was east of Jotunheim, so he crossed the Gulf of Bothnia and arrived in Finland or the Baltic countries. So I can tell you that Utgard Loki lives in Finland or the Baltic countries, or at least that's where the Norsemen imagine him to be. Frankly, Utgard Loki might be a Finnish or Baltic deity or demon that the Norsemen inherited, but we do not know, and these are just speculations. The Otans, and speaking of which, they weren't necessarily giants, but some are, and these are a group of beings that share a Proto-Germanic origin. Jotun is cognate with English Etin, which is another name for the bogey. The bogies were malevolent spirit-like creatures akin to elves, as opposed to a race of people, and in Proto-Germanic, the word would have been Etunas. The Jotuns are the Norsemen's explanation for the forces that inhabit the outer regions, the ones that are wild and chaotic, like thickets of forest or the mountains of Scandinavia. My guess is that early Norsemen interacted with non-Germanic tribes from Scandinavian mountains, and they projected their view of these Etunas onto these tribes from those interactions, and the myths of the Jotuns showed up. As for the giant part, it could be inspired from the giant rocks in the Scandinavian mountains that look like petrified giants, or seen as traces of giant activities like rock formations. Perhaps as also a result of exaggeration by the early Norsemen of the non-Germanic tribes, people of the northern latitudes tend to have a taller stature anyway, and barbaric people would be the ideal candidates for exaggeration. Home of some of the dwarves, Sindri's race, that forged some of the stuff for the gods. Some associate this with Svartalfheim, though they do not subscribe to this view. And I just think that this association between these two realms, such that they're one realm, is a bit flimsy. Nidavellir is mentioned a few times in the Eddas, as is Svartalfheim, and a very few times, twice in the Poetic Edda and none in the Prose Edda. And I think it's a desperate attempt by scholars to identify these two as one in hopes of having a realm with more information. Nidavellir translates to dark fields, though others say it means downward fields. As this was where dwarves that craft and mine live, it's associated with metallurgy. So though the Vikings knew of mining, most of the time they got their iron from the bogs. Bogs are peatlands that have dark soil. The dark coloration of the boglands from which iron was extracted reminds me of the name Dark Fields, that is Nidavellir, that the dwarves smith dwell in. So Nidavellir isn't an underground mine shaft, but more likely a peatland. So if you look at the map on the left, that's the map of the peatlands, and you can see it's concentrated in the northern parts of Sweden and in the northern parts of Finland. And it's like a U-shaped densely area, and perhaps that might be Nidavellir, or Nidavellir might be a idealized peatland as a sum total of the peatlands in general. Nidavellir is also said to be north of the Slit River, wherever that is. In the poetic Edda, it mentions that the binding of Loki, and then in the next few stanzas, Nidavellir is mentioned. 36. From the east there pours through the poisoned vales, with swords and daggers the river slid. Northward the hall in Nidavellir of gold there rose, for Sindri's race, and in Okolnir another stood, where the giant Brimir his beer hall had. This is in Poetic Edda Luspa 36-37. So I do want to know, Helheim is in proximity to Nidavellir, and perhaps Nidavellir is to the north of it. Styx of the Greek lore is analogous to the Slid River of Norse lore. Niflheim, realm of mist and cold, one of the two realms that existed at the start of creation, the other being fiery Mooseballheim. When the two met, the hot and cold mixed, and the ice of Niflheim started to melt, and the 11 rivers were created, and from the waters arose Ymir. Niflheim is also called Niflhel, and sometimes Hel is located within Niflheim, or is Niflheim. The Arctic Ocean, where there is ice, there exists a mist called sea smoke, and may be the source of the Nifl aspect, as Nifl means mist, fog, or cloud. In Niflheim, assuming Niflheim is the northernmost portion of Scandinavia as well as the Arctic Ocean, and it kind of makes sense that these Vikings would project their view of hell, a cold dark place, onto a actual cold dark place, and now that becomes a backdrop for any mythology or legends. The 11 rivers. They flow from Niflheim according to Snorri's Edda, and they originate in the Hvergelmir, a pool where Odin sought the knowledge of the runes. We could trace some major 11 Nordic rivers to their source, but that won't go far. First, you have to identify what those 11 rivers are. My guess is that people didn't bother to find a river source, as it was dangerous, as the people had to venture into the mountains, such that they could only guess where these sources were. River source, as it was dangerous, as the people had to venture into the mountains, such that they could only guess where these sources were. The Norsemen might have reasoned that all rivers must have a source, and they extrapolated those rivers to have a single source somewhere in the mountains of the north, and the rivers of Slid that flows from Hell is actually inherited from the Indo-Europeans. So I wouldn't be surprised if these Slid rivers and the 11 rivers, instead of being traced to a well in Jotunheim, were traced to a well in Helheim or Niflheim. More research is needed. The Styx River, by the way, was partly inspired by the harmful Mavronevi River in the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Is there a similar river in Scandinavia that could be harmful? That might have been the inspiration for the Slid River? That's sea smoke. Jarnvidr, the Ironwood Forests, where, according to the Prose Edda, chapter 5, creation continued. There exists a hag that brought up the two wolves that chases the moon and sun, the children of Fenrir, and the Prose Edda mentions that the children of the hags were very wolf-like in their behavior or shape, and that the wolves are from there in origin. So where are these Jarnvidr forests? Could it be the Baltic goddess Medina who's associated with the wolves? The Ironwood is located near Skrymir, which might be Finland or Baltic states. Perhaps the wolf children could be the pre-Indo-European Koryos. Wolves do live in Scandinavia, though, and in fact borders Sweden and Norway. So wherever this Jarnvidr is, there must be some wolf cult going on. And the Ironwood could be the European hornbeam. It is to the southeast of the main Scandinavian region, if anything, and also in the Baltic country. And if it is in the Baltic country, I mentioned the Baltic goddess Medina, who could be the inspiration for the hag that lives in the Ironwood. But this is just speculation. I mean, Medina is a she-wolf, or at least depicted as one, and also has an escort of wolves. And the map to the right is a distribution of the European hornbeam, which is sometimes referred to as the Ironwood. The problem is that ironwood refers to multiple kinds of trees, and we don't know for sure, without more evidence, what this ironwood forest could be. Let's look at Alfheim, home of the light elves, but we must understand what elves are. Let's start with their etymology. Elf is from the Proto-Germanic "albis" from Proto-Indo-European "albos", meaning white, or Proto-Indo-European "ulb", meaning to grasp. At least that's the root that's from, and it would have been cognate to English labor and Sanskrit ribu. The ribu in Vedic lore are divine handymen of the gods, and interestingly, elves are known for their craftsmanship. So I chose the latter etymology. The thing to note is that elves are spirit-like; as such, the realm of Alfheim must be a postulation. If these spirits are in the realm of man, they must live in their own realm, and they postulated a realm for elves, these spirits, called Alfheim. Svartalfheim. Remember how I said I do not agree with the idea of Svartalfheim and Nidavellir being the same? And I'm going to say it again. It might be an attempt by scholars to make a realm that has more information from two realms that have very little information. Dark elves are supernatural beings. Dwarves are said to be here that forged some of the gods' weapons in Svartalfheim. I've said that Nidavellir refers to the Boglands, but Vikings weren't ignorant of mining though, so I might say that Svartalfheim is an idealization of all the mines and shafts below the lands of Scandinavia. Though I do want to point out something interesting. The association with dwarves and mining survives even today. In the tale of Snow White, the dwarves are miners. The dwarves were probably abstract spirits in the Norse lore, but they might have been partly inspired by children or actual short people who were employed in mine shafts, as their short stature would allow them to move through the crevices in the mine shafts. Mooseballheim, which is the counterpart of Niflheim, and Niflheim was inherited by the Vikings from their Indo-European ancestors, and then it was projected onto the northern extremes of Scandinavia. Muspelheim might be of a similar fate, only that it was projected to the south. My guess is that Muspelheim was a postulation by the Vikings who needed a contrast to Niflheim. The Norsemen saw the ice melt to create the rivers and water, and extrapolated that a fire realm met the cold realm of Niflheim to create the rivers of the world. Perhaps Muspelheim referred to the subterranean realm, where they have imagined to be fiery, likely from seeing volcanoes, maybe Christian influence, but it's a bit of a speculation. Surtur is recorded in the 10th century text, meaning he is an old being. In Iceland, a volcanic region is called Surthellir, and there was an actual cult to Surtur going on during the Viking Age. So I do want to conclude. I was able to identify Midgard, Jotunheim, and Nidavellir, and Niflheim with some degree of confidence. The rest was difficult. I do want to see which of the 11 rivers were called the Alavigar, and what river the Norsemen projected the Slither onto. But it's nice to know in general that most legendary and magical places have some degree of truth and realism to them. Thanks for watching.